Cargo Area B.
What?
Cargo Area B.
What's going on in Cargo Area B?
At this point, the somewhat irritated co-pilot was trying to get the engineer to explain what was happening in the area being announced. Smoke detected, rear cargo B, the flight engineer finally explained.
All right, cut the ventilation.
August 19th, 1980. Riyadh International Airport, Saudi Arabia. It's 7:35 p.m. and Saudia Flight 163 has just arrived from Karachi, Pakistan. Its final destination will be Jeddah, and at this moment, it's waiting for the boarding of the 287 passengers who will be on this flight. Some of the crew and about half of the passengers are Saudi citizens, along with 85 Pakistani passengers and 32 from Iran. Most of these passengers were heading to Jeddah to participate in the Hajj, as Jeddah is the main international gateway for travelers going to Mecca. The aircraft is a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, commonly called L-1011 or simply TriStar, a wide-body commercial jetliner built by the American company Lockheed Corporation. It was the third aircraft of its kind to enter service after the Boeing 747 and the McDonnell Douglas DC-10, and like the latter, the TriStar has a 3-engine configuration. Between 1968 and 1984, a total of 250 L-1011s were manufactured. And since its introduction, the aircraft has been involved in 56 incidents resulting in 534 fatalities. At the controls of Flight 163 is Captain Mohammed Ali Khawiter, 38, with 7,674 flight hours, though only 388 of those hours were on this type of aircraft. Notes attached to this pilot's profile indicate he was slow to learn, failed several attempts to become a pilot, and found it more challenging than usual to adapt when switching from one aircraft to another. He's joined by co-pilot Sami Abdullah Hassanin, 26, who had only been licensed to fly the L-1011 for 11 days. Like his captain, his records warned airlines of his poor progress as a pilot. He had a negative evaluation during training, which led to his expulsion without certification to fly. However, he was later reinstated and allowed to finish his training. Additionally, flight engineer Bradley Curtis will be in the cockpit, who, like the pilots, had minimal experience on this aircraft, with only 157 flight hours. Curtis suffered from dyslexia and never passed his training to become a Boeing 737 pilot, so he ended up as a flight engineer. At 9:08 p.m., the Saudia L-1011 began its takeoff roll. The takeoff was smooth, and they started climbing to their cruising altitude. The captain was whistling and singing as they ascended. At 9:14 p.m., while they were departing Riyadh, an alarm started going off in the cockpit.
Cargo Area B.
What?
Cargo Area B.
What's going on in Cargo Area B?
At this point, the somewhat irritated co-pilot was trying to get the engineer to better explain what was happening in the area being announced. Smoke detected. Rear cargo B, the flight engineer finally explained.
All right, cut the ventilation.
After these initial moments of confusion, the pilots asked the engineer several questions to ensure the smoke was contained and had not spread to other parts of the aircraft. The captain then said that if that was the case, they could continue without issue. But 1 minute later, another smoke alarm sounded, this time for cargo area A.
Should we go back?
I'd say yes.
What's the procedure in the checklist?
Let me look it up.
So the flight engineer, who we recall was dyslexic, was now tasked with finding the procedure for smoke in 2 cargo areas. While the engineer did this, the captain, instead of starting a return maneuver or communicating with air traffic control, continued climbing while whistling. The engineer couldn't find anything in the manual and started checking to see if the smoke alarms were false. Nearly 5 minutes had passed since the first alarm, and Flight 163 was still climbing. A minute later, the captain asked if the engineer had found anything in the manual, to which he responded that there was nothing on the matter. After hearing this, Captain Koita ordered the engineer to personally check what was happening in the cargo area.
If I see or smell something, I think we should return to Riyadh.
Curtis left the cockpit to investigate and didn't take long to find signs of trouble. In the rear section of the passenger cabin, people were already complaining and alerting the crew to smoke coming from the cargo area. Once he relayed this news to the captain, the decision was finally made to return. At this point, they were 95 kilometers from the airport.
163, we're returning to Riyadh. Cleared to reverse course for Riyadh. Any reason?
At that moment, before the co-pilot could respond to the controller, a flight attendant burst into the cockpit, alerting the crew that the smoke had turned into fire. Flames from the cargo area had melted the cabin floor, and fire was now visible in the area near the rear of the plane.
Saudia 163, we have fire in the cabin. Notify the fire trucks.
Chaos reigned in the passenger cabin. The flight attendants kept calling on the radio, asking everyone to sit down, but it was impossible. As the flames and smoke spread, the passengers in the rear section started crowding toward the front. The flight engineer went back out to check the situation, and when he returned...
Yes, it's just a fire in the rear.
Just a fire? What do you mean?
No, it's just smoke.
All right, but we're already turning back.
This conversation was completely inconsistent with the observation made by the flight attendant, who had warned of fire. Perhaps the smoke prevented the engineer from seeing the flames? At this moment of incredible chaos on the plane, the cockpit seemed to be experiencing an entirely different situation from the passengers. The co-pilot exchanged messages with the control tower, without declaring any kind of emergency. The captain started singing again while flying, and the engineer kept mumbling nonsensical phrases.
No problem, no problem, no problem at all, no problem, no problem.
The captain stopped singing for a moment and asked the engineer to calculate the plane's weight and landing speeds. The co-pilot asked the captain if they should declare an emergency, but Koita replied that it wasn't necessary. For about 15 seconds, Koita and Curtis discussed whether the fire trucks had been notified until Hassanan finally stepped in to explain that he had already requested them. The screams and shouts from the passengers could now be heard in the cockpit, while the flight attendants continued to ask for calm over the intercom. The captain then reported that Engine 2, the center engine, had stopped working. Although this should have alerted them to the gravity of the situation, nothing seemed to change. The captain started whistling again while the engineer, once more mumbling nonsensical phrases, now kept repeating, "A piece of cake, a piece of cake." Was it fear that made him act this way? If so, why didn't he clearly communicate the severity of the situation to make the pilots aware of how dire things were? They were now very close to the airport. The pilots were going through the pre-landing checklist, but they were using the checklist for a normal landing, not an emergency one. They activated the no smoking signs, checked the anti-ice systems. Even in the middle of such an emergency, they took the time to turn on the tail logo light.
Now everything is fine.
"15 seconds later, another smoke alarm went off, and Captain Kaweta started singing again as he ordered the landing gear down. At that moment, the flight attendant burst into the cockpit again, much more alarmed than before, warning the pilots that there was a lot of fire in the rear section, and the emergency exit in that area was completely inaccessible.
Fire? Then put it out. Use the extinguishers.
The flight attendant, resigned, replied that they had already used 6 and the fire was still out of control. The plane was now visible from the airport, and it was emitting a lot of smoke from the central engine area, which then turned into large flames coming from the fuselage as they approached the runway. "21 minutes after the first fire alarm, Saudia Flight 163 landed safely on the Riyadh runway. The captain made a perfect landing, but inexplicably, instead of applying the brakes fully, he let the plane roll down the runway for 2 minutes and 40 seconds, with the fire trucks racing behind them. Just as they were about to stop, the plane turned left onto one of the taxiways and finally came to a halt. The fire trucks approached the aircraft but discovered that the engines were still running, making it dangerous to get too close. The firefighters observed flames through the 4 rear windows on the left side of the aircraft and began spraying the plane with as much foam as they could gather. Meanwhile, the air traffic controller relayed the firefighters' concerns about the engines to the crew. The pilots responded, and shortly afterward, they finally shut them down. Inside the cabin, passengers rushed toward the forward exits as smoke filled the aisles. However, the flight attendants never attempted to open the doors. Either they had been told not to, or they couldn't reach them. In the tower, the controllers heard the final transmission from the plane. "Affirmative, we are trying to evacuate now." After that, all further calls went unanswered. By this time, the toxic smoke, containing carbon monoxide, nitrous oxide, hydrogen cyanide, ammonia, and other deadly chemicals, was spreading throughout the aircraft. Its spread was worsened by the inexplicable decision of the pilots to shut all the ventilation grills, preventing the smoke from escaping the plane. The fumes quickly overcame the passengers and crew as they queued at the emergency exits, killing all 301 people on board. Moments later, a flashover occurred, causing the combustion of the accumulated gases, and the fire engulfed the entire plane, forcing the firefighters to retreat. The aircraft burned for several hours. By morning, the hollow shell of the L-1011 remained on the taxiway, standing like a grim monument to the hundreds of people who perished inside. What happened? What caused the fire on Saudia Flight 163? The investigation couldn't answer some of the most puzzling questions about the accident. The exact cause of the fire was never determined because the evidence had been destroyed in the blaze. The most likely explanation was that something in a passenger's luggage caught fire, perhaps a box of matches or a bottle of kerosene brought along for cooking during the trip to Mecca. Although these items weren't allowed on the plane, inspections consisted only of random checks, so anyone who wanted to bring them likely could have done so. The resulting fire burned through the protective ceiling panels of the cargo compartment, allowing the fire to spread into the passenger cabin. This contradicted the Class D designation of the compartment, which was supposed to mean that a fire inside would extinguish itself. In practice, however, the materials used to build the compartment were inadequate to contain the fire. As a result, Saudi investigators recommended that the FAA change the designation of the L-1011's aft cargo compartment to a class with more fire protections. Although the fire aboard Flight 163 was a severe emergency, it was clear that the high death toll was due to mistakes made by the crew. Investigators calculated that if the pilots had stopped the plane as quickly as possible and ordered an immediate evacuation, everyone likely would have survived. The investigation couldn't conclusively determine the reason for the delay, but there are a couple of possibilities. First, evidence from the cockpit voice recorder suggests that Captain Kowaita might never have realized the seriousness of the fire. He could be heard singing and whistling throughout the flight and never ordered First Officer Hassanin to declare an emergency. There were many warnings from the flight attendants that the situation was dire, but it's possible that he either didn't hear them or was lulled into a false sense of security by the repeated assurances from Flight Engineer Curtis that there was no problem and that everything was under control. There were indeed many problems, but investigators believed Curtis might have been trying to calm himself down rather than provide an accurate assessment of the situation. Another, more sinister but less credible theory was presented by a witness to the crash nearly 30 years after it occurred. Michael Busby, an American defense contractor, owned a villa overlooking the airport and watched as the accident unfolded. In a 2010 article, he claimed that the reason Flight 163 didn't stop and was not evacuated immediately was due to the presence of the Saudi King's Boeing 747, which was about to take off just as Flight 163 arrived. According to Busby, protocol dictated that nothing should delay the Saudi King's plane, so perhaps Captain Kowaita saw it and chose not to stop until they had reached a spot where they wouldn't interfere with the departure of the 747.